Hello and welcome to the Living Well Show, the program that strives to empower adults to live life on their own terms. I am your host, Nicolette Hume, the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Lake Oswego Adult Community Center. And today's show, we will be focusing on healing the hurt. We can often feel at a loss when trying to heal our past hurts or when dealing with our unresolved grief. My hope today is that you receive the permission, assurance, and practical guidance to discover where emotional pain lives within our body and how to replace it with thoughts that can help us feel not stuck anymore. I'd like to introduce today's guest, Georgena Eggleston. Georgena is a trauma specialist, a grief guide, a frequent guest on KATU Channel 2's AM Northwest, and she is the author of the book Mourning, Discovering the Gifts in Grief. So welcome, Georgena.
Good morning.
I would like to start today with understanding a little bit more about your background and what that journey looked like to becoming a grief guide and specialist.
Nicole, it began on a winter morning in Norfolk, Nebraska. It was January 1995, and I awoke paralyzed in my bed. I could hear my husband downstairs, and he was with the boys making them breakfast. It was Saturday, so I could sleep in if I wanted to, but I couldn't get out of bed. And what had happened was grief finally caught up with me, and I was paralyzed by it. You see, my brother Mark had died by suicide in June the previous year, just 6 months later. And of course, I was shocked, like everyone else in my family, devastated by this loss. But I did the usual thing we do in Nebraska. I just got everyone organized. We had the funeral, comforted his friends, his children, my parents, and went back to work in the fall as a speech language pathologist. I didn't even realize that I was experiencing grief one Sunday when I started to cry in church and cried the entire day, just 10 weeks after Mark died. I didn't recognize grief. So finally, grief said, "Oh, you're not going any farther." And I was paralyzed and depressed. And the depression lasted until May. And it was in that state of depression that I began to really have compassion for myself, for how much I was doing, for how sad I was. And that was just the beginning of the journey, Nicole, because in less than 4 years, 5 people in our family died. So I was speaking not long ago, and my son Vincent said, "Mom, why did you choose grief? Of all the speakers I heard today, yours was the hardest topic." I said, "Vincent, I didn't choose grief. Grief chose me."
I cannot even imagine, and you'll go into your story further, but some of the traumatic events, I don't even know how you're sitting in front of us today with this amazing bright smile and spirit, and I just can't even imagine your journey has gone through to get to this point of helping others.
It's been a lot of listening, Nicole, and what I've discovered is grief does not break us, but it breaks us open. And it breaks us open to learn to listen to the guidance of the body as we navigate the emotions that come up, and then discover our inner strength, our inner brilliance. And it's quite the journey, needless to say. And it's one that none of us escapes, because loss is a part of life. And grief then is a universal consequence of significant loss.
Well, and one thing I can say is that when you have come into our center to do like a 4 to 5 week series on grief, I
Mm-hmm.
can say that many participants have left feeling very much empowered. I know that there is a time and place for things like grief support groups, but one of the things that we've noticed is that sometimes people can feel stuck in that space, or that there's no progress forward in terms of resolving some of that grief. It almost can feel like that reminiscing in those spaces, in those group spaces over years, can kind of hold them captive. But I can
Mm-hmm.
say a lot of our participants again felt very empowered. And one of the things I've noticed too is that even individuals who may think that grief is just about the loss of someone's life, that really, in what I've learned from you, is that that is just one form of grief, that there's many more than just that.
You're absolutely right. I call them the 6 Ds, the 6 devastators. And
Mm.
trauma does that to us, and natural disasters. And then we've got divorce and diagnosis. And people don't often realize that when they have received a medical diagnosis, this is a huge loss. This isn't the way my life was supposed to be. So it's important to recognize, oh, there's a grief here, there's a loss here, and be with those feelings, as well as the death that we experience. And really and truly, Nicole, one of the things that's so interesting is that we're a grief phobic nation, but not any longer. People may not recognize that we're in grief, but with the coronavirus, we all experienced loss of life as we knew it. And this significant loss plunged us all into grief. People were reluctant to call it that. They said, oh, I'm in isolation, I'm in anxiety. Grief is a process. It's not an emotion only. It can be, but it's like an umbrella. And there are many emotions that go with the process of grief. And it's so important for people to recognize it. And that's why I'm so glad we're having this conversation this morning, Nicolette, because our life goes from order to disorder to reorder over and over again. And when we realize nobody's picking on me, this is part of life, and really grief is a gateway to growth. And who said growth is comfortable? Here we are.
Well, and one of the things that I have read in your story, um, you not only suffer the grief of your brother, the loss of your brother, but there was several different losses that you encountered in a relatively short period of time. Could you go a little bit more into that?
Certainly. So Mark was the first to die in our family. And then later that month, my father-in-law died, and we had had the opportunity to say goodbye to him, which we hadn't been able to say to Mark. Mark's death was sudden death, and it's a different kind of loss and grief with sudden death very often. So my father-in-law, Clarence, died later in June of 1994. And then my mother died of a brain tumor in July of 1997. And in December of that same year, my dad dropped dead of a heart attack. And I was doing okay. I was making it through those. I knew mother and dad were together. Mother's death, we'd been able to spend time together. I'd heard her say I couldn't have had a better daughter. How many people would love to hear that from their mother? But it was the death of our son, Reed, in January of 1998 that brought me to my knees. It devastated the landscape of my life, Nicolette. Reed was one of these charismatic, artistic, athletic, handsome kids who'd never failed publicly. And when he failed a breath test, the last time I saw him, he'd been kicked off the basketball team, suspended from school for 3 days, and had his head in his hands, the shame already too great to bear. And normally I would have gone over, taken his hands down, looked him in the eye and said, Reed, we'll get through this. But when Reed was upset as a teenager, he was in 9th grade, you left him alone. So I walked next door to comfort his girlfriend because she too had been suspended. His dad was talking to the basketball coach, and Reed got up, ran out the side door, told his buddies he'd see him on the basketball floor next year. But something snapped between leaving the school and arriving home. And Reed bent over a shotgun and literally lost face and died by suicide. And so that brought me to my knees. And it was the grief of that. I remember his dad arrived home first. And so when I arrived, I breathed in sharply, seeing the ambulance, the fire truck, the police cars. And that grief, Nicolette, was in my body for several years. And life breathed me. I really wasn't able to breathe deeply as a result of that trauma. And that happens to people.
Oh my gosh. I just cannot even imagine. I have a son who is that age, and so that is something that hits me in a personal spot because
Mm-hmm.
like you said, when they're teenage boys, their emotions are all over the place, and
Mm-hmm.
when they're young, as you know, young boys or little boys, you have that ability to comfort them a lot easier. But as they get
Mm-hmm.
older, they need that space, and you want to be
Mm-hmm.
respectful of that. But
Yes.
what I've learned with teenagers and suicide, that it's not the typical warning signs that we would see with older adults or what have you. It almost seems spontaneous,
Mm-hmm.
which it sounds like with your son, it was more spontaneous. And then again, with a lot of what feels like earth shattering situations in life, people can do very irrational things to cope with that. Um, you know, I don't know if you'd call it trauma, but it's just
Mm-hmm.
that what am I going to do? That fear, that instantaneous fear. But I just can't even, again, imagine how in the heck, with all of those, deaths, one right after another, some of them that you saw coming and some of them you didn't, but
Mm-hmm.
how you are, again, in front of me with this spirit and smile, it just blows my mind. Um, and I do know that, sometimes when those types of deaths happen with children, that unfortunately um, the couple it can affect the couple. Is that something that happened in your situation? Because you no longer live in Nebraska, so
That's
I'm sure people
right.
are
That's
curious how
right.
that affected life.
Mm-hmm. Well, before I answer that question, which I will, I am a member of the American Association of Suicidology. And so I
Okay.
receive their journals. And one of the things I'm very happy to say is there's a great deal of research being done now on impulsive suicide. And
Yes.
that's what I believe Reed died from. We found his journal in his room. Um, he had been an 8th grader when that was something they had to do for English class. And they'd been asked to write about one of the most tragic things, upsetting things, maybe was the word, that had happened in their lives. And Reed wrote about the death of his Uncle Mark. And he said, I can't imagine how anyone can do that to their self. And when I found that, along with Reed's plan, Nicolette, to major in 5 sports in 4 years, I knew that he had not planned this either. Mark's death was the result of being exhausted and tired. Reed's was not. So to answer your question, it was as if I really needed to get the lessons on loss, because not only did then, after Reed died in 1998, we closed our business in 1999. We had a healthcare company in Nebraska. I was a speech pathologist, and we were serving 4 rural hospitals and 20 nursing homes. And we knew that there was going to be a market turn and attempted to position ourselves that way. But even big rehab companies closed. And so we closed our business in June of 1999. And I really felt like a failure as a businesswoman, Nicolette. And then we moved from Nebraska, which was a very smart thing to do. But as many people know, when we move, it causes stress. It uproots us from the support systems that we had. And then I began the training that really led to my healing. And that was very, very helpful. And eventually, my husband and I divorced. We were like 2 trees that grew in different directions. And it was not Reed's death that was the impetus of that, but a 20-year-old issue that we had had. And so there's a myth about the fact that so often the divorce rate goes up with people who have had a child die, and that's not the truth. So I'm happy to be able to share information with our audience. And oh yes, and it was interesting, Nicolette, because here I was with all of these different kinds of grief. And it was the grief of my divorce that plunged me into the state of anxiety. With Reed's death, I was sad. The sadness was so heavy, I was exhausted to the bone. With my divorce, I was so scared. I woke up at 2 o'clock every morning wondering, how am I going to do this? Because we'd been in a relationship for 40 years and married for 37. And we still loved each other so much. But what we realized, like many people do, it was like, oh, to be free to move forward, we need to do it individually. And I'm imagining, Nicolette, when we all come out of this COVID thing, there might be an increase in the divorce rate.
Yes. I was just thinking that as you were saying that, is it, people think, oh, COVID is what is causing these relationships to, fall apart. But I think COVID is really taking those issues that may have been underlying and just bringing them to the surface, or more in many people's face. And so kind of like what you were saying about that myth of, is it really the death of a child that breaks people apart, or is it just, that underlying issue or issues that are coming to the surface? So I'm glad that you did touch on that, because we are unfortunately going to be seeing that, and it's really unfortunate. It's just so unfortunate.
COVID really was quite the wake-up call for the entire planet. And I see it as a tremendous learning opportunity. Just like I said, grief is a gateway to growth. What this did is it took us from being able to be distracted outside. It brought us into our homes. And for many people living alone, it really brought them into a kind of isolation. And it's very interesting to me that COVID affects the lungs. And that's where grief lives, Nicolette, is in the lungs. And so, as I said, it was really an opportunity for us, every one of us, to be broken open and experience the different kinds of losses, the content, and contact of being in the workplace, or economic devastation that happened to so many people. For some, it was the health that happened. It was interesting to me, Nicolette. Personally, I experienced a real shift in my perception when my caseload went up dramatically. And so I started seeing people on Zoom and by telephone. But there was still not being in my car, not driving around Portland, not commuting for an hour at a time sometimes. It shifted my perspective on things.
And that's interesting that you talk about the lungs, and you said that's where grief kind of lives. And I have heard this way of thinking that the body remembers, or the body holds on to these certain things. And I know that one of the methods that you practice, is it the Rubenfeld method? Am I right on that? Or Rubenstein?
You're right. Rubenfeld synergy method.
And they kind of talk about that. So could you kind of go over those certain areas of the body in which certain ailments do live? I've heard things related to the heart and so on. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, it's really important for all of us to remember, like I said, loss happens to all of us. Grief is that universal consequence of loss, and grief is an emotional process. And so look at how the emotions have come up in 2020 as various things have happened to us as a global society and what's happening in the United States. And so emotion lives in the body, and thoughts create feelings. And so it's really interesting to me that we can no longer bypass emotion in our country. It's here. And so to get back to your question, the body tells the truth. The mind can be mean and the mind can lie. It can trick us. And so what I've discovered in working with clients is very often, as you said, the heart is what's been shattered by so many losses. And for many people now, it's the death of a dream, not necessarily the death of a person. It's like, who am I now that I'm not in this job? So the heart is the place that so often when I say to people, what are you noticing? They'll go there first. The second place that people experience their grief is in their throat. It's as if they can't say the truth, or they can't honestly wail and scream and get this pain out, because loss results in severe pain. So many of my clients too experience a tight neck or tight shoulders. And then what I experienced 6 months after Reed died, Nicolette, I was at his grave, the morning after what would have been his 16th birthday, because his friends had gone there. They came to our house for a barbecue, and then they said, okay, we're going to see Reed. And I said, great. And so I thought, well, I better go and see how this place looks. And there were all these little blue candles all over. They'd sung a roaring happy birthday. So as I was down scraping the candle wax off of his tombstone, I reached up, and there in my shoulder was this excruciating pain. It felt, Nicolette, like a saber-toothed tiger was grabbing me. And
Oh,
I screamed
wow.
out loud. But what it was, I later learned as I started in through the Rubenfeld Synergy training, is that it was the back of my heart in such
Hmm.
pain that it felt like the saber-toothed tiger had me. So and then the last place that people experience so much pain is in the stomach and the hips. So there's metaphors for all of these. So when people can begin to access the guidance, to get the messages, their lives can shift just like that. So one of the questions I ask people, Nicolette, when they have a pain in their neck is, who or what is the pain in your life? Or if there's that pain in their stomach, what can't you stomach anymore? Or if their hips are tight, what's preventing you from moving forward in your life? The body tells the truth, and it's full of messages and metaphors.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that because one of our first shows, we talked about creating boundaries. And one of the things
Mm-hmm.
that people who, especially that may be a new concept to them, is just noticing in the body where it's hitting a nerve and just,
Mm-hmm.
cueing into those certain messages that we have or fear, noticing that in our bodies, that our body is continually, sending those messages. But I do feel
Mm-hmm.
that in our culture, we don't really tune in that way. We tend to tune out more than anything, tune out versus tuning in.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and it's also interesting that you talk about these areas of the body that really, it just sounds like all in our trunk, so to speak, is where we hold all of these things, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's in the front or back. But it doesn't sound like our other extremities that we're really experiencing any of that. Is that true? Or do some
Actually,
people?
right. So it's very interesting. I had a woman come to see me, and I said, so where are you noticing the tightness? And she said, in my thumb. So we did the
Hmm,
process, which is recognize where the pain is or the grief. Recognize that you're in this state of discomfort and pain. Then relate to it. So I invited her to enfold that pain with her hand. And it was interesting. Then she listened to the message. But what's so remarkable about this is the meridian that goes from the lungs all the way out, Nicolette. So I just didn't
okay.
mention it because it doesn't happen very often to many people. Other people too can experience pain in their feet. And the reason is that I didn't mention that, I said, the hips not moving forward, it's less likely. So the whole
Okay.
body can be a place where these emotions manifest as aches, pains, tightness, sensations.
So let's say if someone is experiencing pain in their neck or shoulders,
Mm-hmm.
and you are working with them individually, what does that process look like? So they come in and they're like, I'm experiencing this. How
Mm-hmm.
does the Rubenfeld method help heal that?
Okay. The Rubenfeld Synergy Method is a duet of talk and touch. So in non-COVID times, people would come in and either sit in a chair or lie fully clothed on a massage table. And I would touch them. And our hands as synergists are calibrated to listen. So we hear the tension, we see images, and over time, our clients are empowered to listen to their bodies and notice more deeply what's happening. So people come in, and now on Zoom, my clients will be able to notice, okay, there's this pain in my neck. And so I will invite them to put their hand on that place. And I will then lead them through a series of questions. Because the beauty of this method is it takes us out of our thinking brain. It puts us into our feeling brain through the body so that then we can really get in touch with the wisdom that's there. Because Nicolette, how many times have you tried to figure something out and it made it worse? You were just more confused, right? And
Right.
so as a result of this, I'll say, all right, so bring your awareness to that pain. And notice how your hand is contacting your shoulder. Because very often we'll grip, we'll hold tight because we're so afraid to let go. That's what's happened to all of us in COVID. We had to let go. We're in the mystery. So we're in the uncertainty and we're feeling so unsafe. And by coming back to our body, which is still here for all of us in various states of being, people then notice, okay, my hand is resting on my shoulder. And very often I'll ask them to close their eyes because grief is an inside job. And listening deeply is an inside job. And so I'll invite them as I close my eyes to notice, all right, what are you noticing in the space beneath your hand? Is there an image? And this is new to people. So they have to have time to really tune in. Is there a color? Is there a temperature? Is there a texture? And so by now, Nicolette, what is happening is people are going deep. And I always assure them that if there's nothing, that's something. That they can't get this wrong. Because this is their experience of listening deeply to themselves. To really being, yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, no. Continue, please.
Well, and for them then to listen deeply then and hang out, and then I'll ask, is there a message? And it is so remarkable, the messages that people have had. I remember once a young man came in and saw red in his shoulder. This was his place. And we just hung out. And then that red morphed into a red cross. And we just hung out. And the message was, you're going to be okay. And the significance of all of that was that he had experienced a death of a family member in ICU, and it was the Red Cross that was on the doors of the ICU.
Hmm. Well, and I'm curious, some people would say, well, this sounds very intuitive, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe even some people may say woo.
That's right.
But I mean, I'm just going to throw it out there because some people may think of it that way.
Right.
But at the same
Absolutely.
time,
Mm-hmm.
it almost seems as though it's a fusion of therapy. Like you're talking, but you're also moving. You're moving
Mm-hmm.
your body together. And like in the intro to this program today, the thing that I've seen with some of our participants here is you really giving them that space to have that permission to go within and that assurance
Mm-hmm.
to be in that space, like what you were talking about with that young man, because that feels very vulnerable. And sometimes, frankly, we feel vulnerable tuning within ourselves because we're afraid of what we may find or what is conjured up in memory or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
I will say one thing that you told me one time, which kind of stuck with me, was there was a certain situation that I was going through, and at the same time you were asking me, or I think I was telling you about I had a pain. I had a pain in
Mm-hmm.
my foot. And the interesting thing was, is that the first time I ever had experience, you asked me, when did I first experience this pain in my foot? And I was recalling like a decade ago, but it also was, some would say, coincidental. You thought it was certainly more than that, that it was. That there was more to it than it just being coincidence, that I was also dealing at that time with a situation of when that pain first started hurting. And you were telling me that that was kind of showing up in terms of, or I guess you could say manifesting itself at this current time because I was dealing with an old event in a current space. I
Mm-hmm.
hope that makes sense, viewers. I'm sorry. But if
Well, it
you could talk a
does.
little bit more about that, Georgena.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Grief brings up the deepest parts of ourselves, longing to be healed. And so when someone dies, of course, we must heal our relationship with them. And then that's when we go in to notice what are those traumas in our lives that are so deep, it's time to revisit them. And I think I'm recalling that's what was the experience for you. This
Mm-hmm.
pain in your foot was a signal to return to 10 years earlier, to go a little bit deeper, to unpack that. And what's really unique about the Rubenfeld Synergy method is that Alana Rubenfeld, who created it, was studying to be a conductor at Juilliard School of Music. And she had these pains in her back, and she couldn't hold up her arms to conduct. And so she
Right.
went on a journey of healing and ended up becoming certified both in the Alexander technique and the Feldenkrais method. And then she studied Gestalt therapy, thus the talk and the touch and the movement that you picked up on, Nicolette. And so,
Mm-hmm.
what this whole method does is that it brings us back to ourselves where these issues have been. And it was so neat on the boundary program, how you were talking about when we're triggered, and I call it when we're hooked. We all have hooks, and our job is to remove the hooks that trigger us. It's like Velcro. When those
Yeah.
hooks are gone, everything slides off like Teflon, and we can have a
Yes.
really neat life. So, this whole thing is a process. And the trauma, it decimates our lives. I've used the analogy of the butterfly. So when the caterpillar eats and eats, it decimates the landscape. And that's what happens to us in that loss. When Reed died, I felt like I was walking on iceberg in Antarctica, in the ocean. And it was breaking up, and the fog was so deep because my brain was foggy, I couldn't see. And then I went into the cocoon. And what actually happens in the cocoon is the caterpillar turns to soup, and it's completely gone. And then in the third stage, where we begin to emerge as ourself, it's like, oh, who am I now? What's really going on here? And that's when we use the curiosity and discovery that we can then begin to notice, like the imaginal cells that come together. It's a process. You don't go from being a caterpillar to a butterfly in an instant. There are transformations that happen that quick, insights that can allow a person to move forward, and they can come home to themselves and feel very, very different. And it's a process that requires that willingness to go inside, the openness. And it was interesting, Nicolette, the morning that Reed died, I stood at the window and I watched the sun come up. And I said, just as the sun comes up every morning, I'll get through this grief. And I didn't know the how. But what I had done was I set the intention of the what. And so this whole grief process is a transformational process. And right now, we're in the cocoon, in the soup as a country. We don't know who we are. We don't know where we're going. We're in the new now. And that's where we have to trust. And when we can go inside and listen and breathe and trust that our emotions have guidance for us, that we're not alone, there's something bigger going on here, that's when then we can really, really move forward. And in that decimated state, that's where we have to have self-compassion, where if you had a broken leg, you would not expect yourself, Nicolette, to hop out of bed and get your 15-year-old to school. You'd ask for help. And in the cocoon, that's where we need a companion. Those people that can come and sit with us in our grief and our pain and not try and fix us. And then when we're in that beginning to be self-emerging, that takes courage. And that's where so many people are right now. It's like, we have to keep going. We can't go back to where we were. And we don't know what the new is going to look like.
Yeah, and you've hit on a few different points. I mean, we have a hard time having self-compassion for ourselves.
Yes.
For some generations, it can be seen as selfish. Especially working in an older adult environment, you have this senior population where it's like, you know what, you just pick yourself up by the bootstraps and you keep moving forward, people. And then you have this boomer generation who, especially in a time of COVID, I feel like their lives, as many of them are transitioning into retirement, that has
Mm-hmm.
changed, whether it's due to just not working and maybe a change in no longer being of a certain title, finances change and what have you, but also just what does this other part of my life look like and who's there or who's not there with me and that whole transition. And then you have the millennial generation or the children of the boomers who are very open to the idea of self help and trying to find ways to really heal themselves. And it's just a really interesting time in our society for all of these different ways of doing things and coping with things are really coming together. One thing I will say too is that uh, people, especially that come to our or who came to one of your talks, I found people, again, that were really helped with the trauma they were going through. But another interesting thing I saw was some people walked away with this sense of, I I have encountered some of these real traumas and setbacks in my life, but I'm actually realizing maybe how far along I've come,
Mm-hmm.
and the resilience that it took to get there. And they're able to kind of take the long view now at some of those trials and tribulations. But for people who are beginning on that journey of introspection or wanting to do that really hard work and heavy lifting, where would you say for people to start with that? Because it is very daunting and scary.
It is. So it's very important for people to know that you don't get over grief. You don't go around it. You've got to go through it. And when we can go in, which COVID required of us, it gave us a giant pause. When we can go in and then go deep, that's where the gold is. So how do you do that? There are wonderful books out there for people to read. I'm going to say every time you notice yourself resisting, here is a simple thing to do. And when I'm talking about resisting, I'm talking about resisting exercising. Waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning, resisting the fact that you're awake and you want to be asleep. Stop and acknowledge the resistance. Just be with it. And then embrace it, which instead of pushing it away, just allow yourself to be with it with curiosity and discovery and a willingness and openness to listen. And then finally, you may release it to love. So that's what this would look like. It was interesting this morning, Nicolette. I was talking to a friend who was describing what had happened when she awoke on Wednesday morning at 2 a.m. and how she was so irritated by that. And she tried and tried to go back to sleep, and she couldn't do it. Last night, the very same thing happened. And that time, she got up, she listened to a couple of podcasts that were comforting for her. She acknowledged she was in resistance of not sleeping. And then she embraced it and she said, okay, What is the most kind and loving thing I can do for myself right now? I taught her that question. And she ended up then being awake from 2 to 4 again. But this morning when she woke up, she did not wake up tired. She woke up refreshed because she hadn't been pushing. So every single person that's listening to this today knows that they're in some form of resistance from time to time, or they're in pain, or they're in heaviness and sadness, or what we call depression. And so, this, what I say is recognize it, relate to it, and then it is released. And it's so interesting, Nicolette, because people that are showing up in my virtual office are saying, "What's
Mhm.
wrong with me? I just can't exercise anymore. I'm exhausted and I can't exercise." I said, "That's okay. Recognize your resistance to exercising, and then embrace that and release it by inviting a friend to exercise with you." I'm in that same boat. So every morning, I have a lovely phone conversation with a woman that lives either somewhere in Portland or on the East Coast. And we talk and I walk, and they are my walking partner. So I'm giving people permission to recognize the resistance, recognize the pain, and then to relate to it. And you can relate to where the pain is in your body. And then you can then ask what its message is. And over again, when we recognize the resistance, when we embrace the emotion, then it automatically releases because it's given us our message. We've given it our attention. And that's what's happened in this COVID thing, is that we have now more time to do that. And oh, I bless all of those people at home homeschooling their children and working. I'm speaking of myself and us boomers that grief is a call. It's a necessary call to stop and listen, and we have the luxury to do that. And I'm recognizing that everybody has that.
Well, I will say that yesterday was the last day of school for many.
Yes.
So at my house, everyone is excited. My husband's a teacher as well, so he's ending this week too.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to feel too bad for the time being, but God bless
Good.
everyone who had to homeschool.
That's where that self-compassion comes in. That I have got a lot on my plate. And it's so important then to be kind and loving to ourselves.
Well, and you really bring up some interesting points because really in any form of therapy, some of people's biggest issues in terms of anxiety and depression is this relentless thinking and overthinking and these intrusive thoughts or feelings, and how the resistance of that is what keeps it lingering around and such a nuisance for many of us in our lives, or anyone who's ever dealt with any of those things. And so
Mm-hmm.
I find what you say to be certainly helpful for many, and showing again that it's behavioral therapy, cognitive, or any other form of therapy, that it really comes down to just letting things flow. Like in
Mm-hmm.
meditation, they talk about, kind of as if our thoughts are leaves on a river or stream, just letting it flow and not fighting it. And so I really appreciate kind of bringing awareness to that. And as we are, getting closer to the end of our program, What are some things that you really want our viewers to um, focus on or to remember? What is the most important things that you'd really like to share, or anything else that you would like to share that I haven't covered yet?
Well, remember, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And so to get out of that mean mind, you get down into the body with some of the things I demonstrated today. And I wanted to share with people what I do every morning. So every morning when I wake up, I notice, what state am I in? And I don't judge it. And this can be a physical state, like this morning I woke up with a headache. It can be an emotional state of despair. It can be a mental state of, oh my gosh, I'm so worried about XYZ today. And it can be a spiritual state of, where is God? Where is good? I feel like I am alone. It can be that state of fear of finances. So every morning I notice what state I'm awaking in. And I ask the question, how old do I feel in this moment? Because just like we touched on 10 years ago, Nicolette, you were in a different age category. And very often we'll feel like a little one or a teenager or that confused 40-year-old or whatever it is. And again, without resistance, when we're curious, when we're in a state of discovery, there's a different part of our brain, the nucleus accumbens, that is activated. And it's different from that place in our brain when we're in fear. Then I'll notice, okay, where is this? How am I feeling in my body in this state of wherever? I'll float a hand there, and then I'll just notice, okay, is there a message here? And then I will get my essential oil. I'll sit up in bed, put my feet on the mattress, so that means my knees are pointing to the ceiling, and for anywhere from 1 to 9 minutes, I'll breathe in through my nose and out through my nose. And I'm smelling eucalyptus oil. Heck, you can do it with your coffee. Nothing fancy. And what that does, again, Nicolette, is it gets us out of that mental chatter down into our body. And you can even do it by noticing the temperature of the air. 1 minute to 9 minutes. And so those are the things. And then throughout the day, I'm noticing, okay, is there something I need to recognize, relate to, release? So those are some strategies for our listeners: to be compassionate with yourself, to reach out and ask for help from a companion, to keep going courageously, but not forcefully, not pushing, not making yourself do it, with that discovery and curiosity, that assurance that everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end, that someday this too shall pass, and you'll be in a state of confidence. You'll be in that state of wanting to be radiantly living, aliveness. So those are some things that keep me going.
I think that those are great tools and tips for grounding. And I think even the idea of using something such as scent. I mean, we don't really think about that, but certainly
Mm-hmm.
smelling anything from coffee for some, and eucalyptus or what have you, I think that's a really interesting idea, and I can see how that could be helpful and soothing. Um, so I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate you coming on the show today. I have always valued your work. I've seen it help many within our center, and I just really feel blessed to know you and work with you. And for you viewers, I hope with your new awareness, you will discover how curiosity and self-care can be lifelines to radiant living. Georgena, you have certainly inspired us to go forth and embrace our future with open arms and have the courage to create and live a life that we love. That's it for today. I am your host, Nicolette Hume, and thank you for taking the time to be with us and to be a part of our community. Until next time, be safe, be well, and continue staying curious. Take care.